Hi everyone, welcome to a special web exclusive of Newsbeat. I'm Rashad and I'm joined by our editor extraordinaire, Christopher. We want you to remember back to last year. We released an episode called The True Origins of the War on Drugs. No, we weren't talking about Nixon's war on drugs, or Reagan's war on drugs, or even Bill Clinton's war on drugs. 3 strikes you're out, anybody? As complicit as they all have been in driving up incarceration rates in this country, it was Harry Anslinger, a man most Americans know nothing about, who made the drug war his personal crusade. Anslinger had taken over the Bureau of Prohibition just as its ill-fated alcohol ban was ended, so they needed a new cause. A notorious racist, Anslinger and his agents aggressively pursued Mexicans and African Americans. He called jazz music satanic. He said marijuana causes white women to seek relations with African Americans. He even insisted that weed leads to, quote, communist brainwashing. And poor Billie Holiday, the legendary jazz artist, was also a target of Anslinger's bigotry. As horrible as this all sounds, consider this. America is still very much in the throes of Harry Anslinger's drug war. And as a result, more than 450,000 Americans are in prison for drug offenses, U.S. citizens, up from 40,000 in 1980. In the federal system alone, nearly half of the people sitting in prison were convicted of drug crimes. And if we need any reminder that the drug war continues to be racially skewed, listen to this. According to the nonprofit Sentencing Project, African Americans and Latinos represent 57% of all drug offenders in state prisons, despite research showing drug use is relatively equal across racial lines. And if we really want to be honest about how the drug war has been used as a battle axe against minority communities, take Richard Nixon's top aide, John Ehrlichman, who admitted that the express purpose of Nixon's drug war was to arrest African Americans.
So John Ehrlichman was one of the henchmen for Richard Nixon. So now here's Ehrlichman in his own words. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities.
I know it's a lot to unpack, but trying to rectify all this is our special guest, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey, a member of the Homeland Security Committee and co-founder of the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls. Watson Coleman sponsored a resolution recently that, among other things, blasts the war on drugs as a complete failure, calls on Congress to apologize to the American people for its decades-long $1 trillion plus crackdown, and implores her colleagues to institute civil remedies and restorative justice for those punished by federal enforcement. Congresswoman, welcome to Newsbeat.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've recently done something that some people may consider a little risky when you called on your fellow colleagues in Congress to apologize for the United States' war on drugs. Can you talk about what you hope to accomplish and why it was important to blatantly call for an apology?
We put forth this resolution, which kind of reminds us how we got here in the first place. It even acknowledges an interview that Ehrlichman, who was an aide to Nixon, did, which said that, we couldn't just make black people and hippies illegal. So we thought what we'd do is get at them and associate them with the type of drugs that we were going to assign to them. So in terms of the hippies who were against the war, it was marijuana. In terms of the communities of color, particularly the black communities, it was the war, it was heroin as the identifiable problem. And so they went about ensuring that laws were such that people were incarcerated for not dealing these drugs, but even just using these drugs. It's disrupted families for generations. It has created an underclass that it has been stigmatized by this. And while we may not be able to restore the losses that we've had in many instances, there are things that we can do. We can apologize for this failed policy. We can acknowledge that we need to be moving in a different direction as it relates to addiction, and that the same people who are addicted to opioids today are no different than the people who were addicted to other drugs like heroin in the past, and that those individuals that we can engage in some restorative justice with, we ought to be looking at what our policies are, what our laws are, and make the changes necessary to bring about the sort of fairness and equality that was absent in that very protracted and evil intended effort.
Powerful, powerful stuff, Congresswoman. This is Chris, and I just wanted to ask you. So, I think it's really important for people to consider for a minute what you outlined, which is the real origins of the war on drugs. Of course, Nixon and Reagan typically come to mind, but as you know, it was Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics, who initiated this crackdown. And amazingly, he still has his disciples, such as Chef Joe Arpaio comes to mind. What does it say about our leaders that we've allowed Anslinger's policies to continue?
What it says is that we haven't given it the attention that it deserves, and that we've been distracted with doing other things that we think are attempts to create a fairer opportunities for people, but we've ignored something that is as substantial and as ingrained as this is. And so that's like during the good years. Now we're in the bad years with this administration, and it just means that we've left on the books opportunities for them to justify doing some of the heinous things that they do on many different levels, including this level. So while you had the former administration that was kind of rethinking this whole issue of people who are imprisoned for the use of drugs, you have an administration now who is overturning all of those guidances on trying to be more fair and more responsive to what we should have been doing. So in this environment, with things like this still hanging out, with our not acknowledging that we were wrong, that this whole thing was wrong-headed, you give the Sessions of the world the opportunity to validate the Arapaios of the world when they don't deserve that validation.
Yeah, now, and you bring up a great point here. Now, of course, the Trump DOJ under Jeff Sessions has re-escalated this war on drugs. He rolled back Obama-era rules that gave states discretion to create their own marijuana policies, despite it being illegal at the federal level. He has demanded federal prosecutors impose the toughest sentences possible for drug crimes. And in language that sounds eerily similar to Anslinger, then Senator Sessions once declared that, quote, good people don't smoke marijuana.
Just from my experience in dealing with this, we need to set a nationwide understanding about the problem. This is very real. This drug is dangerous. You cannot play with it. It's not funny. It's not something to laugh about. Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Yeah. What's your strategy to chisel away at these hardline policies to create real and lasting change?
So first of all, let me just say that Sessions needs to check his family out, because I'm sure someone in that family has experienced marijuana minimally. I mean, it's just too common. If anybody went to college, they probably experienced it. So that's crap, and it's just a reflection of just how evil he is and how evil intended his policies are and how racist he is. I think, first of all, Congress, this is a good first step. This is not going to change a lot of lives, but it can change some lives, and it can certainly change the generations that have come after those who've been so wrongly dealt with with regard to the war on drugs. So first, we're going to deal with this sort of history and ask for this apology and ask for this recognition that we need to examine our policies to see where we can apply restorative justice to bring about some equality. Secondly, we're going to work very hard to get a Democratic majority in the Congress, and hopefully in the Senate too, because with the Congress that we have, supporting or being silent with regard to the evil that this administration is doing, it's not a great place for the people in our country, and it certainly isn't a great time and space for those who are addicted to something other than opioids. For some reason, we can treat opioids as if it is this public health issue. And I think, unfortunately, we do that because we recognize that more whites than people of color are addicted to opioids, and that they get addicted in a different way than folks did necessarily so in the height of the war on drugs, particularly crack cocaine and heroin. But they're still the same people. The issue is still the same. There's an addiction. That addiction is a public health issue. It is a personal health issue. And we need to be addressing them with the same resources and consideration that we're doing now with opioid addiction.
I think you're making an important link here, Congresswoman. I mean, would you go as far as say as the way we actually treat drug addiction is also racist?
I think that, bottom line is that the way we've treated drug addiction is definitely racist until we've suddenly become enlightened and found out that opioid addiction being the operative word here to a substance that you can abuse and has a negative impact on your health and your community, is suddenly a health issue as opposed to a criminal issue. So, yeah, I mean, Ehrlichman acknowledged that was the intent to discredit and to neutralize and even neuter communities that might be disagreeing with Richard Nixon at that time. So racism is rearing its head at the beginning of this and all throughout it.
Can you just, for our listeners, give us a glimpse of how the drug war has affected the people in your district? Does it mirror basically what's going on across the country?
The way we've treated drug addiction in the communities of color has in fact devastated many families and even communities. There are women who are incarcerated because of their relationship with a man who dealt with the drugs. There are men incarcerated because they happen to have marijuana on them or they were caught using a drug. Even though the use of drugs between blacks and whites isn't really that different, the incarceration of blacks is disproportionately higher. And so while African Americans and Latinos represent something like 17% and 15% of the population, they represent over 57% of the incarcerated population. So, that in and of itself tells the story of how we've looked at addressing this issue and who we've decided are the problems in our communities.
And your resolution has received support from some social justice groups. What about members of Congress and your colleagues? What have you heard so far?
I've approached a great number in our Black Caucus, and it's still being circulated, and people are signing on to it. I've also reached out to the Tri-Caucus, the Asian Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, and the Progressive Caucus, asking them to look at this and to consider coming on board. And some other people have approached me about it in Congress. So we have, I guess, more than 24 or so people on board right now. But it's very early in the process because we really literally dropped this earlier in the week. And we really talked about this in a Black Caucus meeting a little over 2 weeks ago. So the process is to, send information to the various offices of members and give them an opportunity to look at it and give me some feedback and sign on if they like. I believe that this is an expression of responsibility on the part of Congress, which lays out a whole history and which lays out a need to apologize, and which says that we need to be looking at our policies and our laws now with the eye towards restorative justice. And I believe that at least on my side of the aisle, there are a lot more members who will come on board.
So, and now the last thing from us, it's sort of unrelated, but because you are a member of the Committee on Homeland Security, I feel like it's important to ask you about what's going on at the southern border right now, the separation of children from their parents. And the reports of them being put in cages and detention camps. Can you just talk about the situation with these children down by the southern border?
This is so un-American. This is mean and evil. It is child abuse. It is antithetical to who we say we've been. We've been the the refuge for people who've needed to flee their homelands and their countries for a variety of reasons. This is, it's just evil personified. And these are innocent children, and these are children who have come here for safety and security, maybe some unaccompanied, but many with their parents who opened up their hands when they got to the border and said, I'm seeking asylum, I'm seeking refuge, I need to be protected. And what are we doing? We are separating, we are ripping their children away from them. We are putting them in group facilities. We are demeaning who we are as a democracy and who we are as a free country. It is just evilness. It is absolutely unwarranted, and Congress ought to be standing up against this. But oh right, this Republican-controlled, silent, impotent Congress is letting this administration do whatever the heck it wants to do to people who don't deserve to be treated this way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I want to thank you for joining us on Newsbeat, and also encourage everyone to read Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman's resolution on her website. It's brief, but it gives you an idea of how far and how long this war on drugs has gone, and and the devastation it has caused to many communities. So, Congresswoman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, before we close out this special web exclusive of Newsbeat, we want to give you guys a little more insight into the war on drugs, specifically about how it decimated the life of Billie Holiday. Now, earlier we mentioned our episode called The True Origins of the War on Drugs. That episode featured the author of the acclaimed book, Chasing the Scream, Johann Hari. Now, when we spoke with Hari, he talked in length about how the drug war impacted Billie Holiday and how Anslinger and his agents went after her. So we want to give you a special bonus clip that we have yet to air, and it's called Harry Anslinger's War Against Billie Holiday. Check it out.
In 1939, Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, walked on stage in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan. She wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door because she was African American. She had to go through this. They made her go through the service elevator. And that night, for the first time, she sang a song. It's a song lots of your listeners will know. It's called Strange Fruit. It's a song against lynching. The song describes the bodies of African-American men hanging from trees in the South. And she describes that as the strange fruit of the South. Her goddaughter, Lorraine Feather, said to me, you got to understand how challenging this was. For an African-American woman to stand up in front of a white audience and sing a song against lynching was unheard of. And that night, Billie Holiday received a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who were the federal agency in charge of enforcing the drug laws. And they basically said, stop singing this song. That's where I open my book, Chasing the Scream. And to a lot of people, I think it seems a bit weird when they first read that, because they think, well, what's Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit got to do about the war on drugs? And if you want to understand where the war on drugs begins and why it continues, I think this moment in American history is really important. So the man who's responsible for this warning to Billie Holiday is a man called Harry Anslinger, who is probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He's the man who invents the modern war on drugs way before Nixon, way before Reagan. He's the first person. He's using the phrase war on drugs way back in the 1930s. To understand him, you have to understand who he was. He was a government bureaucrat, and he's appointed because his family, he's related to the guy who was the Treasury Secretary, the super rich guy, Andrew Mellon. And he takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending. So he's inherited this big government bureaucracy, this enormous government bureaucracy that's about to be put out of business. It's been humiliated. It's one of the most corrupt departments in the American government, and it's just lost the war on alcohol. And he wants to keep his government department going. And Harry Anslinger builds a new purpose for his department, the Department of Prohibition. He helps to turn it into the Bureau of Narcotics. And he builds the new purpose for his department around the two intense hatreds that he has. One is an intense hatred of African Americans and Latinos. And it's important to understand, he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s, which is, you have to be super racist to be regarded as racist then. He used the N-word so often in official government memos that his own senator said he should have to resign in the 20s. And The other group he really hated was people with addiction problems, addicts. He'd had this bad experience when he was a kid growing up in rural Pennsylvania with an addict who lived near him, and he believed that addicts were like lepers. They had to be quarantined. They had to be cut off from the rest of the society, or they would spread. They were contagious, he said. And Billie Holiday to him was a symbol of everything he hated. This was an African-American woman who was standing up against white supremacy and persuading lots of white people. And she was a person with a very serious drug addiction. She had been raped when she was 10 years old. Then not long afterwards, she was raped countless numbers of times for money in what was called a brothel. She was serially raped for money, this so-called child prostitution. And she was trying to stun the grief and the pain that she felt with initially a lot of alcohol and later heroin. And Billie Holiday, when she received this warning from Harry Anslinger's men, basically said, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'm going to sing my song. And from that moment, Harry Anslinger's men resolved to destroy her. The first thing he does is he gets this guy called Jimmy Fletcher, who was what's called a bag man. He was an agent for the Narcotics Bureau. Now, Harry Anslinger hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday. It'd be kind of conspicuous. So he employs this guy called Jimmy Fletcher. And Jimmy Fletcher's job is to follow Billie Holiday around for nearly 2 years, a year and a half, and document her drug use. And Billie Holiday was so amazing that Jimmy Fletcher fell in love with her. And his whole life, he felt really ashamed of what he did next. He busts her. When he comes to bust her, she says, I know what you've done. You can search in my pussy. You can do what you damn well please. And she was sent to prison for nearly 2 years. The trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday said, yeah, that's how it fucking felt. She's sent to prison for 2 years. She doesn't sing a word when she's in prison. They make her clean out the pigsty for part of it. But the cruelest thing is what happens next. When Billie Holiday gets out of prison, at that time you needed something called a cabaret performer's license to perform anywhere where alcohol was served. And Harry Anslinger makes sure Billie Holiday doesn't get it. One of her friends, Yolanda Bavan, herself a great jazz singer, said to me, you've got to understand, this is the cruelest thing you can imagine. They take away singing from Billie Holiday. This is, by the way, what we do to addicts. All over the United States now, we put obstacles between them and getting back to a decent life. Billie Holiday relapses into heroin addiction, quite severe heroin addiction. As she collapses in the 1950s, she's only 41 or 42 at the time. She's taken to hospital in New York City. The first hospital won't even take her because they say that she's an addict, they don't want her. The second hospital takes her, and she says to her friend Maylie Duffy on the way in, they're going to kill me in there. Don't let them. They're going to kill me. She was convinced that Anslinger's men weren't finished with her, and she was right. Anslinger's men come to her. She's on her hospital bed. She is diagnosed with advanced liver cancer. She's a very sick woman. Harry Anslinger's men come and they arrest her on her prison bed, on her hospital bed. They handcuff her to the hospital bed. I interviewed the last surviving person, Eugene Callender, who was in that room, and he described what happened to her. They wouldn't let her friends in to see her. They wouldn't let her have candies or her record player. And she obviously went into withdrawal because she wasn't being given any heroin in the hospital. So Maylie Duffy, her best friend, managed to insist that the doctors give her methadone. As she started to recover a bit, she started to regain her strength. Then Anslinger's men have the methadone cut off and she died the next day. One of her friends told the BBC that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. And I think you learn a lot about the drug war, which I then traced through many countries and many places and many parts of the United States from that early story. What is the drug war about? It's about persecuting African Americans. It's about persecuting people with addiction problems. It makes their addiction problems worse. Sometimes people say, oh, the drug war doesn't achieve anything. It's worse than that. It makes the problem worse. But there's another amazing thing about this story. I think perhaps to me the most important thing, I was someone who had one of my earliest memories is trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction problems in my family. And there's something about this story that really helped me. You know, no matter what they did to her, Billie Holiday never stopped singing that song. She never stopped singing Strange Fruit. She would always find somewhere she couldn't perform in New York because of the denial of the license. She would go to the deepest parts of the Deep South and she would sing Strange Fruit. And sometimes people would throw bottles at her on the stage and she would throw them back and she would sing her song. She did not let these people silence her. And, we're often told these stories about people with addiction problems that they're, broken, that they're scum, that we're told barely refined versions of what Harry Anslinger said back then. But to me, Billie Holiday is the most extraordinary hero. And one of her friends said this to me: all over the world, every day, people listen to Billie Holiday and they feel stronger. And every day we follow Harry Anslinger's script with the war on drugs and it makes people weaker. And so this conflict that you saw then is continuing. And I had this moment when I interviewed Yolanda Bavan, who was a great friend of Billie Holiday's. I said to her, I asked her this thing I like asking. I said, if you could talk to Billie Holiday now, what would you say to her? And she'd been telling me how, towards the end, Billie Holiday thought she'd be completely forgotten. She thought nobody would remember her. And she said she would tell Billie Holiday, this morning I went into Whole Foods and they were playing your songs. Nobody forgot you, baby.
The Newsbeat podcast is owned by Newsbeat, Inc. Visit us at usnewsbeat.com. The producer and host of Newsbeat is Manny Faces. Our editor-in-chief is Christopher Towarski. Newsbeat's managing editor is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Our podcast and website are co-produced and managed by Morey Creative Studios. Newsbeat relies on listener support and grants. Artists that appear on the podcast are compensated for original material. To support Newsbeat or contribute to our Artist-in-Residence program, visit us at usnewsbeat.com and click on Support. Subscribe to Newsbeat by Morey Creative Studios wherever you download your podcasts by searching for Newsbeat.